Over the past couple of weeks, I've started to really fall in love with a few players, guys that I believe are in for some monster 2025 fantasy seasons and either come at a little bit of a discount right now or are just too good not to buy into. So today, I have 5 players that I am actively targeting in every single one of my drafts, including the last guy, who I think is the best late round quarterback that you can draft right now. The first player is a guy that I am just completely enamored with in Bengals running back Chase Brown. Personally, I believe that Chase Brown is a lock for a top 10 fantasy season at the running back position this year, with the absolute upside to be a top 5 guy or in a league-winning tier of running backs where he joins Bijan and Gibbs and Achane and Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry, guys like that who are being drafted way ahead of Chase Brown right now. Last year, from week 6 on, Chase Brown averaged over 18 fantasy points per game as the RB7 over that stretch. But if you look at his averages from week 9 on, because those are the weeks where he played a minimum of 70% of snaps, he was on pace for over 1,300 rushing yards, 600 receiving yards, and 12 total touchdowns, averaging 20.5 fantasy points per game as a top 4 fantasy running back. It was Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Chase Brown as the only running backs to average over 20 fantasy points per game over the second half of last season. We know that the Bengals defense is still terrible, which means they're going to have to score more points to keep up with teams and win games, which means quicker drives, more scoring opportunities, more receiving opportunities, all of which equals more fantasy points for Chase Brown. We've already been hearing about Brown's increased usage in the receiving game from training camp so far. He already had over 50 receptions last year for over 350 yards, but Jeremy Fowler from ESPN is reporting that we should expect an uptick in that usage and be a safety valve for Joe Burrow in the screen game when defenses are really focusing on Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. That receiving usage is part of the reason why Chase Brown was so elite for fantasy football at end last year, because from that stretch, from week 9 on, Brown paced for 80 receptions and over 600 receiving yards. If he's going to do that or more over 17 games this year, I mean, that is everything for fantasy football. Since 2002, every single running back with at least 100 carries and 80 receptions have finished inside the top 10. 12 of the 13 running backs with at least 200 carries and 80 receptions finished as top 3 running backs. The last player to have 200 plus carries and 80 plus receptions in a single season was Austin Eckler in 2022 as the fantasy RB1, which is also interesting because the Bengals offensive coordinator literally compared Chase Brown to Austin Eckler just a week ago. Listen, Chase Brown is the most elite running back who is nowhere near elite running back prices. He is discount Jahmyr Gibbs, and the fact that you can get him right now in the early 3rd round of drafts is absolutely crazy. Sometimes even in the late 3rd, depending on the platform that you draft on. Targeting Chase Brown in the 3rd round allows you to draft elite wide receivers early in round 1 and round 2, then come back to round 3 and grab Chase Brown as your RB1. I actually just did this in my home league, drafting from this 4 spot in a 12-team league. I got CeeDee Lamb at the 104, Drake London at the 2.09, and then Chase Brown at 3.04. And I felt ecstatic about that core to start my fantasy draft. Now moving over to the wide receiver position, another guy that I just cannot stop myself from drafting this year is the recently turned 28-year-old A.J. Brown. Now A.J. Brown is just that dude, man. He is so freaking good. Since joining the Philadelphia Eagles in 2022, A.J. Brown ripped off consecutive 1,400 plus yard and 7 plus touchdown seasons in 2022 and 2023, finishing as the wide receiver 5 and wide receiver 6 overall in fantasy football. Then in 2024, the very scary year that Philadelphia didn't need to throw as much because Saquon Barkley rushed for 2,000 yards and he and Jalen Hurts combined for like 40 rushing touchdowns, and A.J. Brown missed 4 games because he got hurt. Well, he still put up almost 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns, which is a 17-game pace of over 1,400 yards and 9 touchdowns again. So for all intents and purposes, A.J. Brown has never produced below 1,400 yards or below 7 touchdowns with the Philadelphia Eagles, including last year, which was a season where the Eagles rushed the ball at a historic rate of 621 total rush attempts, which is not only the most team attempts since at least 2010. That's the farthest I actually just wanted to go back, but they're the only team that was over 600 rush attempts. And in some years, the league leader didn't even eclipse 550 rush attempts in a single season. And Philly rushed the ball 621 times last year. That is not happening again. Since Hurts took over as a starter, his season low in pass attempts was 432 in 2021. Until last year when he only threw the ball 361 times. That is 70 times fewer than his previous season low. I would not be shocked if Philly threw the ball 80 to 100 times more this year because their schedule is tougher. They probably won't be able to drain the clock at the end of every week, or better yet, they have to throw more to stay in games, win them against better opponents. Saquon Barkley is also another year older, still has a pretty decent injury history from his time in New York, and of course we have the 370 touch curse that everybody wants to talk about. We have the Madden curse as well, so not only will he probably not rush for 2,000 yards again, he probably isn't going to get as many carries, he won't break as many 60-plus yard touchdown runs that just end drives immediately, leading to Philadelphia having to throw more in general, not to mention if Saquon Barkley actually does get hurt, misses even a couple of games, and what that can mean for the passing game if Saquon Barkley does miss time. I'm saying all of this to say, A.J. Brown is an elite NFL and fantasy wide receiver, and you should not be fading him because of last year or the fact that he's now 28 years old. 2024 was his absolute floor as a Philadelphia Eagle, and he was the wide receiver 20 in total points in scoring while missing 4 games, and was the wide receiver 12 on a points per game basis. Again, that is his floor, and he's beaten that production in the other 2 seasons as an Eagle, and he's valued pretty much at that production now as the wide receiver 10 in ADP. A.J. Brown is going to be a fantasy wide receiver 1 again this year, if not even a borderline top 5 guy like he was in 2022 and 2023, and the fact that you can get him in the mid-second round of drafts right now is absolutely bonkers. This video is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Fantasy season is in full swing, and we here at 4for4 are all over it. We've got drafts firing up, leagues are reuniting, and yes, some early group chat smack talk has already started. This year on 4for4, we are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too. Whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league, I've always been a fan of how intuitive the Yahoo platform is. From draft day to waiver claims, it just works the way you want it to. And to celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. To kick it off, they just dropped Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's just one team standing. With the season right around the corner, now is the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. If you are more into the classics, you can still play in head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing on Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/TMAP. That's yahoofantasy.com/TMAP. Now, the next receiver I want to talk about is a player that I found myself buying back into this year because of his new situation and just believing that, yeah, this is going to be pretty good, and that is DK Metcalf. Last year, we all wanted to find reasons why Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry and Josh Jacobs switching teams was actually a bad thing for them. They're getting older. Running backs switching teams that late in their careers don't usually work well, blah, 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 blah. Guess what? None of it mattered because all 3 of those guys went to vastly improved teams and situations and absolutely balled out for fantasy football. We should have seen those seasons coming. So when I look at DK Metcalf and his situation for 2025, I can't help but think that all the peripheral stuff just doesn't matter, and it's going to work and work well in Pittsburgh, at least for 2025. Aaron Rodgers is the best quarterback that DK Metcalf has had since Russell Wilson at the start of DK Metcalf's career. No, he's not the Aaron Rodgers from the 2010s, but he's still good enough to give us elite fantasy production at the wide receiver position. In 2021, Davante Adams was the fantasy wide receiver 2 at 29 years old with over 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns. He had 169 targets, while the next closest Packers receiver, who's actually Aaron Jones at the running back position, was at 65 targets. So Davante Adams had over 100 targets more than the second most targeted guy that year. In 2022, without Davante Adams in Green Bay, Rodgers did suffer from not having any good wide receivers, but Allen Lazard was a top 35 fantasy wide receiver with almost 12 PPR points per game while putting up 800 yards and 6 touchdowns on 100 targets, nearly 30 more than the next highest targeted player that season. 2023 was, of course, the Achilles year, but 2024, Garrett Wilson was the fantasy wide receiver 10 overall with 154 targets, and Davante Adams was the fantasy wide receiver 11 with 114 targets on the New York Jets, or a 17-game pace of 176 targets just from playing with Aaron Rodgers. Those 2 receivers alone combined for 268 targets last year, while everybody else combined for 303 targets on the New York Jets. Aaron Rodgers has and will continue hyper-targeting one guy, and that's usually a pretty great thing for fantasy football. And that guy this year is DK Metcalf, who is also just head and shoulders better than everybody else the Pittsburgh Steelers have to catch the ball. And my entire X timeline right now is just filled with highlight real catches from DK Metcalf in training camp, and it also helps that Aaron Rodgers and DK Metcalf are rooming together in Latrobe. Prior to last year's wide receiver 32 finish, Metcalf had finished as the wide receiver 7, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 16, and wide receiver 21 the previous 4 years. That wide receiver 7 year was the 1 year that he kind of put everything together. He had 83 receptions, over 1,300 yards, 10 receiving touchdowns. Then the next 3 years after that, he was never able to put everything together once again. He either had 12 touchdowns, but he didn't break 1,000 yards. He either had 140 targets and 90 receptions, but he only scored 6 times. Or he did have 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns, but only on 66 receptions. That's why he's never been more than a solid fantasy wide receiver 2 since. But put him in an offense as Aaron Rodgers is hyper-targeted guy with absolutely zero competition behind him, and it's possible that he gets back inside the top 10 and for fantasy this year, just like Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson were last year and in Green Bay. Going in the late 4th or even 5th round in ADP on all platforms, Metcalf is a tremendous target for anyone who starts the draft with 1 or even 2 running backs or an early tight end, and you're looking for upside at your wide receiver 2, maybe even your wide receiver 1 spot in that 4-5 turn. Even if you have a start, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, going wide receiver, running back, I'll take DK Metcalf as my flex option in the 4th round, and then I'll attack running back and tight end in the mid rounds to really fill out my roster. And as I mentioned to start the video, the best late round quarterback that you can draft right now is Packers quarterback Jordan Love. I find myself really buying into this 2025 Green Bay Packers team and the upside of Jordan Love in what could be a top 5 offense in the NFL this year and a top 3 team in the NFC. I think a lot of people are really down on Jordan Love and the passing offense in Green Bay because Josh Jacobs was great last year. Jordan Love really wasn't, but I believe most of that is due to Love's groin injury that he suffered in Week 8 and played through for the rest of the year. Prior to Week 8, Jordan Love was on a 17-game pace of 4,600 yards and 51 touchdowns on over 600 pass attempts and was the quarterback 4 in points per game over that stretch. Once he suffered that groin injury, though, from week 8 through 17, Love's passing rate and production fell drastically to the tune of 3,700 yards and 19 touchdowns on just 450 pass attempts. That is a stark difference between the first and second half of the season that is not easily explained away by them just figuring out how to use Josh Jacobs. It's the fact that Jordan Love got hurt in week 8 and then played hurt for the remainder of the year. The other reason that I know the second half was Love's injury and not a change in offensive philosophy is how the Packers operated in 2023. In 17 games, Love threw the ball 580 times for over 400 yards and 32 touchdowns, finishing as the fantasy QB 5 in total points and quarterback 6 in points per game. So for a sample size of pretty much 22 games over 1.5 seasons, we have seen the Packers throw a ton, 580 times in 2023, paced for 610 times to start 2024, and then a pretty clear line was drawn in the sand in week 8 when Jordan Love got hurt to then turn away from the passing game and win games with defense and Josh Jacobs. But that is not the formula that I believe Green Bay wants to have if Jordan Love is healthy. They want to pass the ball. And again, as we saw in 2023 and at the start of 2024, Jordan Love has legitimate top 5 fantasy upside. I mean, he's already done it. And even though I'm not a believer in Matthew Golden, if I am wrong on him and Golden is actually really good, especially as a rookie, that's even better for Jordan Love too. So right now, Jordan Love finds himself in the 10th round in ADP, sometimes even lower than that depending on your specific platform, outside of the top 15 at the quarterback position. There is no one else in his ADP range or behind him that even come close to the top 5 upside that Jordan Love has already shown over 1.5 seasons as a starter. Everybody wants to hope that Caleb Williams is going to break out in the Ben Johnson offense, that Justin Fields can just run enough to be good for fantasy and remain the starter in New York, that Jared Goff won't take a step back without Ben Johnson, that Drake May can do well in a new offense with a couple new weapons in year 2, that JJ McCarthy can replicate Sam Darnold's production in effectively his rookie season off a major knee injury, that CJ Stroud can return to his quarterback 10 production that we saw in 2023, that Trevor Lawrence can be fixed by Liam Cohen and Travis Hunter, that Tua can stay healthy, that Michael Penix can do well in year 2, on and on and on and on and on. Well, you know what I feel most confident in? The guy in the same offensive system with the same or even better weapons around him who already has shown top 5 fantasy upside over a 20-plus game sample. And that is what Jordan Love is as the best late round quarterback in 2025. And since I'm very in on the value and upside of Jordan Love, it would also make sense that I am in on his projected wide receiver 1 as well in Jayden Reed. But I actually just broke down why I love Jayden Reed in a recent video that you guys can find right up here.